He says, I reviewed all the matters of the appointed times in the Bible, and I did not find Shavuot called Atzeret. Right? So this is a big discovery for him, because imagine, think about this for a second. Imagine if I told you in the entire Tanakh, Passover is never called Passover. It's called Chag HaMatzot, Feast of Unleavened Bread. If I told that to any Jew, they'd be shocked. Of course it's called Passover. That's the name of the holiday. No, it's not. That's a later development. All right. Chag Sameach, everybody. I am going to talk today about Shemini Atzeret. Shemini Atzeret is, I think that's probably a hard Hebrew word for some people to say. That is the name of the festival that I'm observing today, and many of us are. Shemini Atzeret is the 8th day of Sukkot, and it's a bit strange because it's actually not part of Sukkot. Sukkot's 7 days, and then there's an 8th day on which there's an Atzeret. Well, what is Atzeret? Atzeret is usually translated in English as a solemn assembly. It's a day of very serious solemnity. But is that what it says in the Hebrew? And that's interesting because it implies the other holidays, the other biblical appointed times, would be just assemblies, and Shemini Atzeret is the solemn assembly. So let's see what it actually says in the Tanakh. So, I'm going to have Lynell read.
So are you saying it's the solemn assembly, Nehemia?
No, I'm saying that's how it's usually translated.
Right, that's what I thought you were saying.
I looked up one translation, and it had a joyous assembly. Well, which one is it? We're going to look in the Hebrew. We're going to find out. And this is actually a really interesting study for me, because I love how words evolve over time and their meanings change. We have what's called a semantic shift, right? Where I actually heard this the other day, that if you go back to English from 500 years ago, they would say there's 5 beef out in the field, because beef could refer to the animal and the food. But today it only refers to the food. You wouldn't say I have a herd of beef in the field, right? I don't think you would, in the pasture. So Atzeret is an example of that. We're going to see what it meant in Tanakh times, or we're going to see what it meant later, to try to get an understanding of, okay, what does this word actually mean? All right, so babe, and you actually have the verses. I'm going to ask you to read Leviticus 23:36. And I'm going to make some comments about the Hebrew there.
7 days you shall bring offerings by fire to Yehovah. On the 8th day you shall observe a sacred occasion.
Ooh, which translation is that?
That's the JPS Tanakh.
Okay. All right, that's Mikra Kodesh. That's the Holy Convocation in the King James. That's a separate study. All right, go on.
And bring an offering by fire to Yehovah. It is a solemn gathering.
Okay, and the word in Hebrew that they translate, right? There's 2 words in English, solemn gathering. In Hebrew, it's Atzeret. Ayin Sadi Resh Tav. Okay, so it is an Atzeret. No, you shall do no
so it doesn't say solemn?
Labor. No, it says Atzeret, whatever Atzeret means. Maybe it does mean solemn. Right, we have to find out.
We'll find out.
So there's a very similar statement, which we don't have to read, but guys, go do your own study afterwards. Numbers 29:35. My favorite one, Nehemia chapter 8, verse 18. And then 2 Chronicles 7, 8 through 10. Now, Numbers 29:35 is there's a list of sacrifices, Numbers 28 and 29. So you'll find all the biblical feasts there, all the biblical holidays in Numbers 28 and 29, along with a lot of sacrifices. Nehemia 8 is when they came back and they read the Torah and they said, oh, there's this thing called Sukkot. We didn't know that. We better celebrate that. And they end up celebrating Sukkot and Shemini Atzeret. And so it's mentioned there. And then in 2 Chronicles 7, 8 through 10, you have Solomon dedicating the temple during Sukkot. And there it's interesting. Sukkot's called Hechag, the feast, right? It's like the feast. Right, so I think we talked about that. Sukkot is the holiday in the ancient Israelite mind. It's the most maybe celebratorious. Is that a word? It's the one you celebrate the most on, and partly because you're done harvesting all your crops, right? And you've taken all your crops in and you've processed them and everything. And now you can really celebrate the joy of your bounty, or the bounty of your labor, maybe. Anyway, so that's in Second Chronicles. So he dedicates the temple and he celebrates Sukkot, and then it talks about the 8th day.
And I forgot to say at the end of the verse, it says, you shall not work at your occupations.
Right. All right, so that's Atzeret of Sukkot, whatever Atzeret means. We haven't defined it yet. So the Atzeret of Sukkot is the 8th day, but there's also an Atzeret of Passover. And most people don't know that. Most Jews don't know there's an Atzeret of Passover, because that's not something we're really told. The Atzeret of Passover is mentioned in Deuteronomy 16:8. Can you read that, my love?
Mm-hmm. After eating unleavened bread 6 days, you shall hold a solemn gathering for Yehovah your God. On the 7th day you shall do no work.
Okay, so
so this is after Passover, right?
This is the Atzeret of Passover, which is the 7th day of Passover. So in Exodus, it says that the 7th day of Passover is a day you're not allowed to work on. It's a holy day, but it doesn't call it Atzeret. It only calls it Atzeret here in Deuteronomy 16. So we have this, quote, solemn assembly or whatever it means, right? So I want to look now at the Targum. The Targum is an ancient Aramaic translation, or really translations. There's more than one Targum. We have both Targum Onkelos, which was, it's a good question when these are from. And let's call them 2nd century CE, roughly, give or take. And then Targum Jonathan. So Jonathan is on the prophets, and Onkelos is on the Torah. And Onkelos has been attributed, according to the legend, it was someone who converted to Judaism. And he said, I don't really know Hebrew as my native language. I'd like to have this in Aramaic. So he eventually had to translate himself into Aramaic. That's the legend. I'm not sure that's true. Seems it's probably not true. But anyway, it's attributed to Onkelos. So they both translated Atzeret as gathering. And it's interesting, they use the Aramaic word kanash. And kanash is a cognate, meaning it's the same word in a different language as the Hebrew word Knesset. Like in Jerusalem, the capital of Israel, we have the National Assembly, which is equivalent to the U.S. House of Representatives, and it is called Knesset. And it comes from an ancient name of an assembly that existed in the early Second Temple period. When they returned from Babylon, the province of Judah and the Persian Empire was run by what's called Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, the men of the Great Assembly. And that's where the modern Israeli Knesset got its name. It's also where we get the name for a synagogue in Hebrew, which is called Beit Knesset, house of assembly, right? And even the Greek synagogue means assembly, right? Like when it talks about the waters gathered in Genesis, in Greek, it uses a word based on the word synagogue, right? Like the Greek form of that, right? All right, so we have both Targum Onkelos and Targum Jonathan. Sometime around the 1st or 2nd century CE, they're translating Atzeret as assembly, which is 100% correct. That's what it means. I'll just give you the end.
There you go.
Atzeret means assembly. That's literally what it means. It has nothing to do with solemn. They just made that up because let's be honest here. I'm almost certain that the King James translators made that up. I have to investigate it more, but probably they made it up, or they liked it, even if somebody else made it up, because they wanted you to go to church every Sunday, right? And they understood Shabbat was now replaced with Sunday in their church, and so they couldn't just say, well, it's the 8th day of assembly. Well, then why do I have to get together the other 7 days? Right, and come to church, right, for whatever my feasts are, right? So they had a special thing, which is a solemn assembly. I think that's probably where it came from. They probably got it from, some translation, like I don't know, maybe in the Vulgate, but I'm not sure. All right, anyway, so we have one ancient translation of Atzeret, which is assembly, which is correct, but there's another ancient translation, which is really interesting, and that's in the Septuagint. The Septuagint is the ancient Greek translation originally of the Torah. Later, Septuagint was applied to the entire Tanakh, but originally it's the legend about 70 or 72 rabbis coming together and translating or King Ptolemy in Egypt. It's a famous story. That only referred to the 5 books of Moses. Later, it was the rest of the Tanakh. But in any event, in Leviticus 23:36, Atzeret is translated in the Septuagint, the Greek translation, as exodion. And if you listen to that word exodion, you'll notice the word exodus. And what is exodion? Exodion is the Greek word that means the finale of a play, usually a Greek tragedy, right? So like, when we go on 4th of July in America and we see the fireworks, and at the end of the fireworks, they just send up all these massive fireworks, and we call that the grand finale, right? Or in music, you have a grand finale. So exodion is the grand finale of a Greek play. So why would Atzeret be called exodion? So first of all, it's the end of the holiday or the holidays. We'll get to that, which isn't wrong. But they're also noticing that the word Atzeret in Hebrew comes from a 3-letter root, ayin sadi resh, which means stop. And so they're like, okay, this is the stop, the end, the cessation of the feast. And therefore, it's just like the end of a Greek tragedy. It's the grand finale of the festival, right? That's how the Greeks were trying to explain it, right? And they didn't have a word in Greek for what they thought Atzeret meant, and so the Greek translator said, all right, well, we have this word that applies to Greek plays. And exodion, as far as I know, only applies to the end of a feast in Judaism. And it's really interesting. The definitive dictionary of ancient Greek is called Little Scott Jones, LSJ. And it has their definition, its definition number 3 of exodion is, among the Jews, a feast to commemorate the Exodus, which is 100% wrong. What that means, in other words, the people who made the definitive modern Greek English dictionary, misunderstood the word exodion in ancient Jewish Greek sources, right? It doesn't appear in non-Jewish Greek sources, as far as I know. It appears in ancient Jewish Greek sources, the Septuagint, and we'll see another one in a minute. And it means the end of a festal season, right? That's what it means, right? Just like the end of a Greek play, a Greek tragedy. And so they misunderstood it, and they thought it had something to do with the Exodus, which it absolutely does not, even in Greek, right? They're wrong. As far as I know, they're wrong. If somebody could prove, me wrong, prove differently, please show me. So Philo, who is a Jew who lived in the 1st century CE in Alexandria, in Egypt, and so he was a Jew who really didn't know Hebrew, not well. And he said, he's talking about Sukkot, and he says in a book called Laws, chapter 2, or section 2 to 11, he says, and after the festival of Sukkot, that is, has lasted 7 days, he adds an 8th as a seal, calling it a crowning feast. Now, crowning feast isn't my translation. That's the translation I have in my Bible software and ancient text software. And that's wrong, because the Greek word there is exodion, right? So there's this finale, right? So that's really the better translation, calling it a kind of exodion. And he says a kind of, right? He knows this is a term that comes from Greek plays and doesn't organically belong to the Shemini Atzeret. He says not only as it would seem to this festival that it's the exodion, the finale, but also to all the feasts of the year, which we have enumerated. For it is the last feast of the year, right? And it is a very stable and holy sort of conclusion, befitting men who have now received all the produce from the land. Well, what's he mean there, all the produce of the land? Well, it's called Chag HaAsif, or that is Sukkot. It's called Chag HaAsif, the Feast of Ingathering. So Philo is explaining that Shemini Atzeret isn't just the end of Sukkot, and it isn't just the end of the 22 days of feasts in the 7th month, starting with Yom Teruah. It's the grand finale of all the feasts of the entire year, starting with the Feast of Unleavened Bread, Passover in the 1st month, and then in the 3rd month you have Shavuot, and then you have Yom Teruah, and then you have Yom Kippur, and then you have 7 days of Sukkot, and now we have the grand finale where we throw up all of our fireworks and all of our penguins and all of our hedgehogs come and they visit us. And this is the grand finale of it all. That's how Philo explains it in the first century. And where he's getting that is the word atzeret, meaning secession, right? It's the end of something, and right, because it means to stop. And so it's the exodion, the ending feast of the entire year, according to Philo in the first century. Now, I mentioned before at the beginning how there's this thing called semantic shift, where a word means one thing and then it takes on a different meaning over time. And I find that fascinating. I want to see what words mean in different periods. So, for example, today we'll talk about the Feast of Passover. In the Tanakh, Passover is only a sacrifice. You eat a Passover. You do a Passover, meaning you cut its throat and you spill out the blood and burn the fat and you eat it. But you don't celebrate Passover. But in Second Temple times and today, the holiday is called Passover. And if you told somebody in Israel today, the holiday is called Chag HaMatzot, it's kind of referring to Christmas as Yuletide, right? I knew that. It's kind of this archaic thing, right? Pesach is the name of the holiday. So that's semantic shift, right? Nobody is disputing what it meant in the Torah, but over time it takes on a different meaning. And in the New Testament, Pesach is also the feast. It talks about the feast. It has both meanings in the New Testament. It has the sacrifice and the feast of Passover. Okay, so Atzeret, right? Because we're in Shemini Atzeret here, and we have Atzeret of Sukkot and we have Atzeret of Passover. In later times, in Second Temple times, Atzeret has a different meaning. It takes on a new meaning, and that is Shavuot. It's very surprising. Shavuot's Feast of Weeks, right? It's also called Chag HaKatzil, the Feast of Harvest, and it's called Chag Katzil Chitim, the Feast of the Harvest of Wheat. So it's never in the Tanakh called Atzeret. But in Second Temple times, that's the primary name for Feast of Weeks, Shavuot, is Atzeret. And so, for example, when the Torah says in Numbers 28:26, it says, on your Shavuot, which is on your weeks, that is your Feast of Weeks. The Targum, remember we said Targum Onkelos, sometime in maybe the 2nd century CE, maybe a little earlier, he translates your Shavuot as your Atzarta, which is an Aramaic version of Atzeret, right? Which is really interesting. So that's his name for it in the time of Onkelos, whenever that is exactly. In the Mishnah, the standard name for Shavuot is Atzeret, right? They know the word Shavuot, but they don't use it very often. They more normally use the word Atzeret, which is strange. We have Shemini Atzeret for Sukkot and Shvi Atzeret, 7th of Assembly. For Passover, we never have Atzeret referring to Shavuot, but Atzeret is a standard name in the Mishnah because over time the word took on a different meaning. And I bring a passage here which is really interesting. They talk about when Atzeret falls on Friday and if it falls on Shabbat. They're saying basically if it falls on Shabbat, you shouldn't bring your personal sacrifices on Shabbat. You should wait till the next day. And they say, wait, but there's people who say Shavuot's always on Sunday, and we don't want to give them, we don't want to kind of like give them a win, a W, as the young people say. So we don't bring our personal sacrifices on that Sunday. So we don't, acknowledge that their Sunday observance of Atzeret, that is Shavuot. So that's really interesting. Okay, so Josephus in Antiquities 3:252 or 3:10:6, he says, when a week of weeks has passed, and Josephus was a Jewish historian in the 1st century. He was actually, he claims, originally or earlier, he had been a Jewish general fighting the Romans, and he was captured by the Romans. And so then he ends up as a prisoner in Rome writing a book about the history of the Jews called Antiquities of the Jews. And he says, so remember, he's explaining this to non-Jews. When a week of weeks has passed over after this sacrifice, and he's talking about the Omer sacrifice, which weeks contain 40 and 9 days, on the 50th day, which is called by the Hebrews, and he says in Greek, Asartha, right? So Asartha is the Greek transcription of the Aramaic, Atzavta, which is the Aramaic form of Atzeret, right? Remember, this is Shemini Atzeret, 8th of Assembly, but he's talking about Shavuot is Atzarta, is Atzeret, which signifies Pentecost. Right? Now it doesn't, and I put here, or the translator put here, Pentecost I didn't translate this, put Pentecost with a capital P, but that's not really right. When he says it would signifies Pentecost, he means it would signifies in Greek 50th, right? Pentekostein is the Greek word for 50th. So it signifies 50th. They bring to God a loaf, etc. So Atzarta is just the name in Second Temple times of Shavuot. It's very strange. And this is beautiful. Psikta de Rav Kahana, which is in the 5th or 6th century, it says, this is really interesting. It says, you find that just like the Atzeret of Passover, remember, what's the Atzeret of Passover in the Torah? The Atzeret of Passover in the Torah is the 7th day of Passover. But they say just like the Atzeret of Passover is 50 days apart from Passover, so to here, Shemini Atzeret should have been 50 days apart from Sukkot. In other words, why is Shavuot called Atzeret? Because the way they thought about Shavuot in the Second Temple period was Shavuot was the grand finale of Passover. And then these rabbis in Psikta de Rav Kahana in the 5th, 6th century, they're asking this question, okay, if Shavuot is the grand finale of Passover 50 days later, shouldn't Shemini Atzeret be not on the 8th day of Sukkot, but on the 50th day? It's the grand finale. You wait 50 days and then you come back. And what they explain there is, well, in Israel, you don't have rain in the summer. And so you can travel. And remember, the roads were made of mud, despite the Roman, maybe some roads were paved, but most roads were still mud, frankly, until the Jews started returning to Israel in the 1880s. So if it rains in Israel, you can't travel on the roads. So Shavuot, 50 days after Passover, there's no rain. You can come. But 50 days after Sukkot, there's going to be rain, and you're not going to come back. And they say it's like a king who has a son who lives far away and a son who lives nearby. The son who lives nearby, this is what they say in Psikta de Rav Kahana. They have you visit, the king may say to the son who lives nearby, come visit me in 50 days, right? Because he can come whenever he wants. To the son who lives far away, if he comes to visit, he holds him an extra day, right? That's how they're explaining Shemini Atzeret. That's really fascinating, right? This is the grand finale of Sukkot is the way they're thinking of it. But it explains how Shavuot came to be called Atzeret, because Atzeret is the grand finale in a sense. And so the Atzeret was then originally in the Torah applied to Passover, but then later they're like, wait a minute, we have an even greater grand finale, which is Shavuot, and that was called Atzeret. So, and it comes again from the word atzar, which means to stop. Now, in the Tanakh, and remember, this is Hebrew changing over time. In the Tanakh, Atzeret simply means assembly. It may have some connotation of grand finale. Oh, here's another one, by the way, Lekach Tov, which was written around the year 1108. So it's pretty late. He says, I reviewed all the matters of the appointed times in the Bible, and I did not find Shavuot called Atzeret. Right? So this is a big discovery for him, because imagine, think about this for a second. Imagine if I told you in the entire Tanakh, Passover is never called Passover. It's called Chag HaMatzot, Feast of Unleavened Bread. If I told that to any Jew, they'd be shocked. Of course it's called Passover. That's the name of the holiday. No, it's not. That's a later development. So this rabbi in the 12th century, he's probably living in Greece or somewhere in Byzantium. He says, I reviewed all the matters of the appointed times in the Bible, right? He didn't have a concordance. He didn't have strong concordance or some software. He had to read the whole Bible looking for the word Atzeret, meaning Shavuot. And he was sure he was going to find it, and he didn't. And he said, I did not find Shavuot called Atzeret, but our rabbis of blessed memory. And when he says rabbis of blessed memory, that's a technical term that refers specifically to the rabbis of the Mishnah and the Talmud. He says the rabbis of blessed memory everywhere called the Feast of Shavuot Atzeret. That is also the language of the Targum, what we just brought in Onkelos before, right? So that's like, no duh, right? But that was a discovery for him in the year 1108, right? What I said to you is, this is obvious, right? Somebody had to spend probably months researching that in the 12th century, maybe longer than months, maybe years before he came to the conclusion, wait, Atzeret isn't biblical Hebrew referring to Shavuot. In biblical Hebrew, Shavuot means something, in biblical Hebrew, Atzeret means something else. Let's see what it means. So Isaiah chapter 1, verse 13, here I'm going to ask Lynell to read that.
No more. Bringing oblations is futile. Incense is offensive to me. New moon and Sabbath proclaiming of solemnities.
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 And when it's, yeah, go ahead. Sorry. No, go ahead.
Assemblies with iniquity I cannot abide.
So assemblies, they translate Atzeret there. Interesting.
It means gatherings, though, right?
Yeah, it means assembly, some assembling, right? Any kind of gathering, assembling. Now, here we got to read a little bit of a longer story. 2 Kings 10, 18 to 25. So I'll set the background while you flip to 2 Kings chapter 10. So the background here is Jehu was a general in the army of the king of Israel. And he was visited by a prophet who proclaimed him king. And then he went and assassinated the king of Israel. And while he was at it, he also killed the king of Judah who was visiting. And he became king. Now Jehu's king. And one of the things Jehu was commanded to do is wipe out the worship of Baal. So he says, how do I find out who all the worshipers of Baal are versus the worshipers of Yehovah? Now, what's interesting here is that through most of the history of ancient Israel, they worshipped Yehovah together with Baal or Yehovah as Baal. But we had a queen of Israel who was named Jezebel, Izebel, and Izebel was a Sidonian princess. And when she came and married Ahab, she brought the worship of Baal exclusively. Right? So she's saying, you can't worship Yehovah, and she killed the prophets of Yehovah. Now think about this. She's killing the false prophets. Up until then, the false prophet says, yes, Yehovah is our Lord. He is Baal. It's the same God. And that's the false prophets. And Jezebel comes along and says, no, Baal is the only true God. You must worship him, not this Yehovah of Israel. And so she kills the prophets of Baal. Elijah has this thing on Mount Carmel, but there's still people who worship Baal exclusively. And so now we enter into 2 Kings chapter 10, verse 18.
Jehu assembled all the people and said to them, Ahab served Baal little. Jehu shall serve him much. Therefore, summon to me all the prophets of Baal, all his worshippers and all his priests, and let no one fail to come. For I am going to hold a great sacrifice for Baal. Whoever fails to come shall forfeit his life. Jehu was acting with guile in order to exterminate the worshippers of Baal. Jehu gave the orders to convoke a solemn assembly for Baal, and one was proclaimed.
So it's an Atzeret. He's gathering and he's proclaiming an Atzeret. And the significance of the Atzeret is you gather, you come together. And if you want to get all the worshipers of Baal in one place, you can't have a Mikra Kodesh, a holy convocation, because not everybody may gather. But if you have an Atzeret, everybody comes together. So he proclaims an Atzeret, and this isn't a grand finale, right? So grand finale is a beautiful, cute idea, but that's not the Tanakh meaning. The Tanakh meaning, I know after all that, Atzeret is in the Tanakh a gathering, and it's a gathering where you come together. And now all the worshipers of Baal are told, well, you're going to die if you don't come. All right, let's read. So he's sanctified an Atzeret for, an Atzara is the form here, for Baal. It says Vaikha'u, and they gathered, which is interesting. That's a different thing. Okay, now verse 21.
Jehu sent word throughout Israel, and all
Actually, Vaikha'u there is they responded to the call is what it means. That's what it is. All right, sorry, verse 21.
And all the worshippers of Baal came. Not a single one remained behind. They came into the temple of Baal, and the temple of Baal was filled from end to end. He said to the man in charge of the wardrobe, bring out the vestments for all the worshippers of Baal. And he brought vestments out for them. Then Jehu.
So that's interesting. When they came to the temple of Baal, they had some special clothing they put on. And only a true worshiper of Baal will put on that clothing. We don't know what the clothing was, right? Maybe it was an apron or something. I have no idea. But it was some kind of special vestments they would put on. And only a true worshiper of Baal will put that on. And this is interesting. He's like, wait a minute. Maybe some worshipers of Yehovah came who don't worship Baal, and they're just going to stand there with their arms folded. There's this famous photo of during the Nazi times where there's this massive gathering And there's, I don't know, thousands of people doing the Heil Hitler salute. And there's this one man standing in the crowd like this. So Yehu wants to make sure we don't kill this guy. So, okay, now they didn't just gather and show up at some place and think, well, Baal's not a real god anyway, but I don't want to be killed. Okay, because if you don't come, you think you're going to die. You're told that. So, all right. So now they're putting on the garments to show that they are. So it's now the second thing. First they gather. Now they put on the garments to prove they're worshipers of Baal. Now verse 23.
Then Jehu and Jehonadab, son of Rechab, came into the temple of Baal, and they said to the worshippers of Baal, search and make sure there are no worshippers of Yehovah among you, but only worshippers of Baal.
So now it's the third thing, right? Let's make sure there's nobody here who we know isn't who posted on social media, don't worship Baal, he's a false god. Let's make sure those guys didn't sneak in because, well, I mean, he knows because we don't want to kill. Yehu knows that we don't want to kill those people. All right, go on.
So they
went. By the way, Yehonadav ben Rechab, who it kind of just mentions in passing, comes from a famous clan, a famous family of ancient Judah, who's mentioned in the book of Jeremiah. These were people who were converts and so didn't have any ancestral land, and so they didn't drink wine because they don't have grapevines and they don't have to buy wine, and they lived in tents. So that's who Yehonatan ben Rechab is. All right, let's go on.
So they went in to offer sacrifices and burnt offerings. But Jehu had stationed 80 of his men outside and had said, whoever permits the escape of a single one of the men I commit to your charge shall forfeit life for life. When Jehu had finished presenting the burnt offering, he said to the guards and to the officers, come in and strike them down, let no man get away. The guards and the officers struck them down with a sword and left them lying where they were. Then they proceeded to the interior of the temple of Baal. Mm-hmm. They brought up.
Anyway, so here, and the story goes on, go study it. So it's a very important story. It's a fascinating story. So here Yehu is trying to eliminate at least the exclusive worship of Baal. There were still people who continued to worship Baal, and he's actually in the Second Kings he's called to task for not fully getting rid of the high places and everything. But at least the people who worship Yehovah, at least the people who worship Baal and not Yehovah, those he's getting rid of. He's stamping that out. And what does he do? How does he do that? He calls an Atzeret, which simply means assembly, right? There's no grand finale here. It's a one-day thing, right? And you think, well, Shavuot's a one-day thing. No, but Shavuot was thought of as the grand finale of Passover. That's why they called it Atzeret, right? So this is a one-day thing. It's a one-day assembly, just like today's Shemini Atzeret, right? And of course, thing of Baal is different, but linguistically, we're saying the word Atzeret is just an assembly. That's the significance of this. The Atzeret of Yehovah is completely different than the Atzeret of Baal, but it's a one-day assembly. Now, Joel chapter 1, verse 14, I think we can understand a little bit better now that we understand it just means assembly. And I love the idea of the grand finale. When I was a kid, I loved those fireworks. Always hurt my ears, though. But that is not the Tanakh meaning of it. That's a later development.
Solemnize a fast, proclaim an assembly, gather the elders.
It's proclaiming. So this isn't any fixed biblical feast they're talking about. What he's talking about is bad stuff's about to happen. Sanctify a fast, proclaim an assembly. Right? You got to get all the people together in prayer. That's what this means. And that's an Atzeret. It's an assembly where you all get together. In this case, the fast. It says, gather the elders, all the inhabitants of the earth to the house of Yehovah your God, and cry out to Yehovah. So here in Atzeret, the purpose is to gather in prayer and fasting. And it's not any fixed biblical day, right? This is what we would call a voluntary fast day, right? It's time to, call a prayer, a day of prayer, and a day of fasting. And that's called an Atzeret, right? So it just means assembly. And it's also not something specific to Shemini Atzeret or the Atzeret of Passover. It's a word that literally means assembly. And therefore, the 8th day is the day that you assemble And yes, it is a grand finale in a sense of all the feasts of the year and of the 22 days of holidays, not all feasting, in the seventh month. But literally what it means is assembly. And we have one for Passover as well. Then Joel 2:15-16 has a similar thing, if you want to look at that.
It says, blow a horn in Zion, solemnize a fast, proclaim an assembly.
Right. And so it's the same language here. They're gathering. And then it says, what does it say in the next words?
Gather the people.
Gather the people. That's what you do at an assembly. Sanctify the congregation. What does that mean, sanctify the congregation? Right? That's a good question what it means. But basically it means you need them all to come together for the purpose of prayer and fasting in this case. And that says, gather the elders, gather the babes and the sucklings, right? So everybody, the chatan who is in his room and the kala who is in her chuppah, get everybody. Even the people who have their own business going on right now, they're getting married. No, stop what you're doing. Everybody get together because we have to pray to Yehovah. And that gathering is an Atzeret. And the last one we'll look at is Jeremiah 9:1 is my favorite, right? This for me is the grand finale, the crescendo of this teaching, because this really shows me the meaning of Atzeret. So I'll read it, or you can read it and then I'll comment. Go ahead.
Oh, to be in the desert, at an encampment for wayfarers. Oh, to leave my people, to go away from them, for they are all adulterers, a band of rogues. What?
And band of rogues in Hebrew is Atzeret Bogdim. It's an Atzeret of actually cheaters is the word, of traitors, cheaters. And the context here is he said they're all adulterers, meaning they're adulterers worshiping idols. In the Tanakh, idolatry is metaphorically described as adultery, right? We have this covenant relationship of a wife with God as the husband, metaphorically, and even in like the passage we referred to as the Shema, one of the three passages, it talks about your eyes prostituting after other gods, right? So the metaphor there is you're cheating on God by going and worshiping. You're cheating on Yehovah by going and worshiping other gods. So here he's saying all of these people that I'm among, they are all adulterers. They are a band of cheaters, an assembly of cheaters. They're an Atzeret of cheaters. So Atzeret simply means assembly, right? You can't say it's a grand finale of cheaters. That doesn't even make any sense. And you can't say it's a solemn assembly of cheaters. That really doesn't make any sense, right? Atzeret is simply assembly. And today is Shemini Atzeret, and we are all gathered together on Shemini Atzeret, Lynell and Nehemia and Gwenny Penguin and Sedgwick. And who else might be with us?
We had, you guys asked for this, so we brought Penguin Shark. And Penguin Shark only says a couple of things. Penguin Shark says
3 things.
You go ahead. You say what he says.
So first of all, he says, "Oh, Penguin Shark," like he knows how to say his name, and then he says, "Me, me, 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 me."
He says that a lot. He's very narcissistic, but he also knows one more.
He got a necklace when he was in the Shuk in Jerusalem.
He did,
and it says in it Shema Yisrael, and he learned to say another word.
Shema.
Shema.
He says Shema.
Like out of nowhere, suddenly, Shema. That's Penguin Shark.
This is Penny Penguin. She is our first penguin, and she is my penguin. Nehemia got Penny for me when we were first married. And
what happened? Why did I get her for you?
I had fallen. We were hiking. We were doing some stuff, whatever, and I had fallen, and I had torn my rotator cuff, and I didn't know that, so I was just waiting for it to heal. And I went to the doctor one day, soon after we were married. It wasn't long. It was right after, COVID was going on. And the doctor said, "We have to get you in next week for surgery." So I went in for surgery, and they did whatever to my rotator cuff. And Nehemia got me.
And so she's sitting in this chair. She can't lay down. She's got her arm in a sling, and she can't move. And I've got to brush her hair. And I would say, "Come here, Barbie." And so I got her Penny Penguin to cheer her up. And about a year later, she got a sister named Gwenny.
So they travel with us. They're just fun things that we do to travel with. So anyway,
now,
it's just
Penguin
a blessing.
Isn't just a pet. She actually has a special status. and it's official and legal.
Nehemia did this to entertain people as we travel. You know, we travel a
No,
lot.
this is very serious. She has a card, register emotional support animal. And this is the same one they get for like dogs that are registered emotional support animals. And it says birthday.
He entertains people with that when we travel. He makes so many people laugh as we go through TSA. Normally when we go and we check our luggage in, he says to the lady, ma'am, I have an emotional support animal that we have to take with us. And they're like, well, I'm sorry, you can't do that. And Nehemia's like, well, would you
just... supervisor?
just would you take a look? And he hands him the card. And they end up taking the card and passing it around they remember him. Like, in the airports we normally use, they want to see the penguin.
I was passing through Charlotte, and the woman at the check-in said, aren't you the guy with the penguin? Like 6 months after I made this joke. And I was in a hurry, so I didn't make the joke again. But aren't you the guy with the penguin?
So, Nehemia, do you want to pray before we
we're
start taking Q&A?
Today. We are assembled today.
So why? Somebody tell me why.
So the bottom line is, yes, this is a grand finale. It's a beautiful idea, but that's not from the Tanakh. What the Tanakh idea is, this is a day that God commanded us to assemble. And why did he command us to assemble on this day and not, 40 days from now? Probably because it was going to rain in Israel. And it's impractical to gather, 50 days from Sukkot. But really, you notice, the pattern's pretty clear. The 7th day of Passover, which is the end of Passover, and the 8th day of Sukkot, which is actually after Sukkot, because Sukkot is 7 days. We're commanded 7 days to sit in the sukkah. Yesterday, I told Lynell, it's time to take down the sukkah. Actually, I told Heath, it's time to take down the sukkah. And Lynell says, but can't we eat tonight in the sukkah? I said, we can, but the commandment is to dwell in the sukkah 7 days. So it's over.
Sunset.
What's that?
I was going to eat before sunset.
Okay. Anyway, so we took down our sukkah yesterday. And although sometimes, there's this guy who was my neighbor in Jerusalem who put up his sukkah outside in the public area. And then he didn't take it down. And then he left him. People are like, oh, a month later, the sukkah's still there. And 2 months later, the sukkah's still there. And what they realize is he's taken over that part of the public area. And he did it by putting up a sukkah. So I don't want to be the guy who leaves with the sukkah all year, although some people do that.
But we do want to pray for everyone before we leave. And I do want to say that I really appreciate you guys coming to the gathering. I love the fact that we are doing things that are commanded and that we can do them a lot easier. That, we don't have to get in our car and we don't have to get on an airplane, that we can gather together and worship Yehovah together at the appointed times that he's given to us. And to me, that's such a beautiful, beautiful thing. So I'm so happy that we did this.
Amen. All right. And guys, I don't want to just pray for you. I want to pray with you. So everybody bow your heads, raise your wings in prayer. Yehovah Avinu Shabashamayim. Father in heaven, I ask you to hear our prayers. We come to you with contrite hearts. We know we've sinned. We've fallen short every day. There is no man who does not sin, it says. Solomon, in his prayer to you, when he dedicated the temple, he said, there's no man who does not sin. Yehovah, none of us are Solomon. We're doing our best. And it says, if you guard iniquity, oh yeah, who could stand? None of us could stand and be before you if you did not forgive. Father, forgive us. Father, bless us on this day. Father, in ancient Israel, on Shemini Atzeret, the people were celebrating on this assembly the end of the feast of Sukkot, where they gathered in their produce and whatever they had, that was the blessing for the year. Father, let our blessings be stored up and bless us during this time as we're dealing with a lot of difficulties and economically around the world and with war around the world. Father, bless us and bless all those who come to you and turn to you and turn to the place where you put your name forever in Jerusalem to address you, Father, who is in heaven. and bless us with the bounty of ingathering. Amen.
Amen. We do have questions, and I would like to answer questions about today. Good morning, based in the original Hebrew language. Is Shemini Atzeret a separate feast from the Feast of Sukkot?
I feel like we answered that. Ooh, let's ask. Can we put up let's put up a quiz. Can you put up a quiz?
I will have to create
and
one.
ask that question, the quiz. I'll read the next question while you make a quiz.
Oh.
Let's see what everybody says. What does the eighth day represent to Nehemia, and is there a way you keep this day in addition to gathering together? Yeah, there's no work on this day. Now it happens to be Shabbat, but if it was during the weekdays as well, there'd be no work. And no, you do not sit in the sukkah. Kabedyahu ben Yehochanan. So it is only this week. He's asking about Simchat Beit HaShoeva, which I have a teaching on that somewhere. And which was this thing they did in Second Temple times where they would draw water out of the a certain spring, and they had a major celebration. And I'm quite sure that came from one of the high places, because there is no such thing as a water libation in the Tanakh or in the Torah. This might be a weird question. Okay, I'll skip it then. What to use as a program or website to read in English a translation side by side by Hebrew? So I wouldn't be the best person to answer that because I'm reading it usually just in the Hebrew. So, but there is software. There's free things online where you can see the Hebrew, usually broken out. I think they'll have word by word with the English. Doesn't mean the English is right. It's really interesting. You'll sometimes see the Hebrew on one side of a page in a printing, and I'll see the English on the other side, and it'll be a note that the English isn't a translation of what it says in Hebrew. It's a translation of what it says in the Greek Septuagint. So why put the Hebrew there? All right. Did you get that, babe?
Give me just a minute. I have to create it. Wait. Just a minute.
Wow. Someone says, since you brought up Baal, do you think the concept of Torah She'Ba'al Peh has a hidden related little nudge, wink, wink? In other words, so the oral law is called Torah She'Ba'al Peh, and that has absolutely nothing to do with Baal. Right? The Be'al is by. Be'al Peh means by heart. Has nothing to do with it. It's not related. That's just a coincidence. That's only a coincidence that really even, I don't know. I've never thought of that in all of my 50 plus years. Even looking for critiques of rabbinical Judaism, that never even occurred to me. And because in Hebrew, Be'al is two different words, meaning there's what's called an attached preposition. Ooh, we have a quiz. This is fun. Can the penguin take the quiz?
Slack.
Sedgwick doesn't say me, so you would think he's not as selfish and self-centered and narcissistic as Penguin Shark. But here's what he'll do. Oh, I can't see it because this thing's pulls in the way. 1 second. So Gwenny will be like cuddling here, and Sedgwick will just come and push her out of the way. It's just what he does. He won't even say anything. He'll just do it. He's like, yeah, it's me. And
so we're going to go ahead and when you guys finish, let us know. And
yeah, someone says, have you ever heard of Atzeret meaning a proclamation instead of a convocation? Or is convocation a different word? I think convocation in English, someone can look this up and make sure I'm right, means a gathering. I've never heard of Atzeret meaning a proclamation. You could argue based on Syriac that Atzeret has something to do with sacrifice, but I think that's a secondary meaning, like Atzeret meaning Shavuot or grand finale. I've heard the word translated convocation is actually proclamation. No. So the word for, okay, I see what you're asking. So the word convocation doesn't apply to Atzeret. Convocation is the English translation in the King James of Mikra Kodesh. And Mikra means proclamation. But that's, we'll do a separate study on that someday. So when you call someone a Yahoo, are they referring to the one you are talking about? I don't even know what that means.
Nehemia, is Shemini Atzeret a separate occasion from the Feast of Sukkot?
Yes and no.
See there? I knew he was going to go
definitely
there.
yes. It's yes, right? Meaning it's yes because it says to dwell in the sukkah for 7 days. It's a separate occasion, therefore, meaning there's no commandment to be in a sukkah on Sukkot. And what we said yesterday to ourselves is, and you could, like I said, you can look up your sukkah all year if you want. But what makes it special for me and for my family is that we're doing it on these 7 days. So Shemini Atzeret is not part of Sukkot. At the same time, it's called the 8th of assembly. Count 8th of what? It's the 8th day counted from the first day of Sukkot. So it's a bit of a paradox. So were we done? Do you want to share those results?
I did already. And I closed the pour.
Beautiful.
Well, everybody won.
Smart.
I mean, it was yes.
Everybody got it right.
No.
Wait, was there anybody who said, okay. Let's see. Got a bunch of questions. Okay. All right. Some of these I'm just going to skip.
Do you do you understand the verse to be a metaphor?
Okay. I'm going to answer this question. Somebody says, why is the name Yeshua not mentioned after a prayer? I was taught by a Messianic Jew to say his name. I'm not a Messianic Jew. So maybe that is something a Messianic Jew or a Christian would do. I'm neither a Messianic Jew nor a Christian. It's possible you don't know who I am. You can look up in hundreds of hours where I've explained ad nauseum, written whole books about it. But someone says, are there any prophecies that seem connected to this day? I'll leave that for some future discussion. So someone asked, when is Simchat Torah? So Simchat Torah, which literally means the celebration of the Torah, is not a biblical holiday. And it's interesting, when is this holiday? It's a rabbinical holiday, so we got to back up. So in ancient times, even in rabbinical Judaism, they would begin every Hebrew month with the sighting of the new moon in the land of Israel. And what would happen is people would come to Jerusalem and they testify that they saw the new moon. And if they had witnesses that were reliable and they trusted, they would announce that the new moon had been sighted, and now it's the beginning of the month. And what they would do is they would light signal fires. And we'll sometimes call these bonfires, but they're actually signal fires. It was a giant pole with basically it was a giant torch, and they would move it up and down, and people would see, oh, it's not just a field that caught fire. This is a deliberate signal. So there were signal fires that went all the way to what today is Syria, where there were Jews living. And the people who lived beyond where the signal fires would reach, they didn't know which day was the new moon was sighted. Okay, they would send out messengers. Well, the messengers couldn't reach everywhere in time. So if you live beyond where the messengers could reach, you would celebrate each holy day, with the exception of Yom Kippur, for 2 days. That's what was done in many ancient Jews did that. And rabbinical Jews said, well, just because our calendar now is calculated and we no longer have to wait for the sighting of the new moon because we've just made up a day, we're still going to do 2 days in the diaspora. And so in the diaspora, there was this tradition, and specifically it's the Babylonian tradition. There were 2 traditions of how to read the Torah. One was 3.5 years and one was 1 year. And the 1 year tradition was from Babylonia. And in Babylonia, when they finished reading the Torah, one portion every week, they celebrated the completion of the reading cycle at the end of Sukkot. And they didn't do it on the 8th day of Sukkot on Shemini Atzeret, because they celebrated Shemini Atzeret for 2 days. And they waited till the 2nd day of Shemini Atzeret, which is a bit strange because Shemini means 8th. So there was the 2nd day of the 8th of assembly, which means the 9th day. And they said, well, this is awkward. We have a holiday called 8th of assembly, and we're celebrating it both on the 8th and the 9th. So what they did is they said, you know what? Let's celebrate the end of our reading cycle on the 2nd day of the 8th of assembly, so we have some purpose for this day. And they called that Simchat Torah, the celebration of the Torah. Right? So it's a completely artificial holiday that came from Jews in Babylon who were looking for some purpose for the 2nd day of Shemini Atzeret, because of its name, 8th of assembly. And they end up celebrating as Simchat Torah. Now Jews return to the land of Israel with this Babylonian tradition, and now meaning like in the 10th century or something like that. And they, or probably 9th century. And they say, okay, well, we can't do it on the 9th day because we don't celebrate 2 days of Shemini Atzeret. So they combine it with Shemini Atzeret. So to this day, Orthodox Jews in Israel will celebrate Simchat Torah on the 8th day of Sukkot. And in the diaspora, Orthodox Jews will celebrate it on the 9th day. And that's why when we were attacked on October 7th in Israel, they called that some people wanted to call it the Simchat Torah War, because it happened on, and think about, and here's really the interesting thing. It's now become such a dominant part of the holiday in Israel, the celebration of the completion of the reading cycle. If you tell someone it's Shemini Atzeret, it's kind of like, oh, that's like Christmas's Yuletide. It's like they don't even remember that. It's like almost a side point from history. In America, they'll know it, or in the diaspora, Jews will know it, because Shemini Atzeret and Simchat Torah are 2 different days. I hope that made sense. I know it's a bit complicated.
So I want to answer a question.
Yeah.
Someone asked, Darlene, what do you and Lynell do on this day?
Yeah.
Well, we gather together with people, and that's why I was so excited to be able to do a bigger gathering. We can all gather here together, and it's a Shabbat, so we keep it like a Shabbat. Helen asked,
when you say it's a Shabbat, meaning it's a day we're commanded not to work. That's
right. So we don't work on this day, and
so the word Shabbat isn't applied to Shemini Atzeret. It actually calls it a Shabbaton, but that's a separate study. But it's not Shabbat, technically.
That's right. Can we cook on this day since it's celebratory? What are the commands on this special day? That is that's
a whole. So
that's a whole study.
In rabbinical Judaism, if Shemini Atzeret is not on Shabbat, then the rabbis would say you're allowed to cook, because the cooking prohibition, they say, is only specific to Shabbat and not the other days in which work is forbidden. But that's a separate study. Let's leave that.
And James London, I'm glad you asked this, James, because James, he said, but aren't you working doing the study?
So in a sense, yes. But I feel like I've been called to teach Torah. And if you can't teach Torah on Shabbat, then you're doing something wrong. And we definitely have biblical precedents for that. People in the temple, the priests in the temple, one of their busiest days of work was Shabbat, where they had extra sacrifices, number one. And then you see that they gathered together to hear the Torah on Yom Teruah. It's in Nehemia chapter 8. And it says there were people, it says, and the Levites were explaining to the people, it says maskilim, they were causing them to understand. Now, how were they causing them to understand? The Levites were giving some kind of explanation, because the Hebrew language had evolved over time, meaning the Torah was written around 1450 BCE, give or take. And Nehemia chapter 8 is taking place in the time of Ezra, which is around 450 BCE. So it's 1,000 years later. The language changed over time. And the people are like, okay, I don't know what this means. And the Levites were saying, okay, well, in the Torah, when it uses this term, that's what we call today XYZ, right? So they were giving them some kind of explanation. And they were doing that on a holy day. And it's interesting, because then it says the people were crying, and they say, no, today's a holy day. So in that sense, if you're teaching, right, don't cry, and go eat fat foods and drink sweet drinks. That's what we're going to do, is we're going to eat sweet fat foods. I don't know if I'll have too many sweet drinks for me, but most people can. And so the point is that yes, it's work to teach the Torah, but that's the work that you're supposed to do on Shabbat and holy days. And we see that's what they were doing in the temple and even outside the temple on the holy day. So, but no, that's a completely, look, I've been criticized by Karaite Jews. I've been criticized. I don't know that I've been criticized by Orthodox Jews, because they just think I'm a heretic anyway. But by Karaite Jews, I've been criticized for doing a speaking event on Shabbat, and they say you're violating Shabbat. Wait, I'm speaking in a synagogue. Literally, I was speaking in a synagogue. That particular incident, the one that I'm thinking of. What are you doing on Shabbat? Who are you teaching on Shabbat? And if you're not, why not? If you can teach, why aren't you teaching? on
And I
Shabbat.
mean, I'm not working, like, I'm not going to be doing any of I do a lot of the financial aspects of the ministry, try to help that. I don't do any of that type of work. But when it comes to teaching, or it comes to ministering, or it comes to, gathering together to create the webinar is work. But I believe that's what Yehovah has called me to do. So, the study on not cooking on Shabbat, I want Nehemia to do that study. I really do, because that was one of the first things that was really important to me to learn about when I started keeping Torah. And I would love for us to do a study on
Tell them
that.
the story about how you thought Jews fasted on Shabbat.
So when Nehemia and I first started dating, knew nothing. Guys, I knew nothing, literally nothing. And so anytime we were going on a date, it was usually on a Shabbat night, a Saturday night. And so Nehemia would always say, okay, I'll meet you right after sunset, or I'll pick you up after sunset. We'll do this after sunset. And I thought, okay, well, he doesn't eat until after sunset on Shabbat.
Because then we'd go to a restaurant.
But that's
So
because...
she thought I fasted every Shabbat. Now, I could do with a fast once a week, don't get me wrong, but it wouldn't be on Shabbat.
Yeah, I knew so nothing. And Bridget, I would love to do that. Dave, I really would love to do a study about cooking, because when you know nothing about... Gwenny knew a lot more than I did. But when you know nothing about the Torah, and you know about how to keep the commandments, and you've been taught your whole life that they were done away with, there's a lot of study. I've learned a lot in the last 5 years.
I follow this young lady on
Tithing,
TikTok.
That's important,
and
Jessica.
She posted something really interesting about how she has a friend who was just criticized by their Christian pastor for keeping the feast. And he said, you're putting yourself under the law. That was done away with. We're New Testament believers. I thought that was such a fascinating story, that someone who is a New Testament believer is being criticized for keeping these Old Testament feasts. And that's particularly funny because in Colossians 2:16, it says, judge nobody in matters concerning the observances. I forget what the exact term is. New moons and feasts or something like that. And here the Christian pastor was criticizing this person for exactly what Colossians 2:16 says. How interesting. Maybe that was off the topic.
Okay, this is a really good question. Dr. Gordon, you made a good point that sometimes the English is not the correct translation. Most of the time. Can I just say most of the time?
I wouldn't say it's most of the time. Most of the time, it's okay.
It's okay. It's okay. I didn't say it wasn't okay. I said it's correct.
Yeah.
How can we trust any translations then? That's a good question.
So you shouldn't trust any translations. Translation is an art, not a science. There's an there's an old Italian saying that the translator is a traitor, which is a play on words because translator and traitor sound similar. And they sound even more similar in Italian. And what it means is that there is no way to perfectly translate something from one language to another. Every translation is an interpretation. And so when you're reading 5 different translations, you're really reading 5 different interpretations. Now, when I read it in Hebrew, I'm also interpreting it. It's an implicit interpretation in a sense, or if you're more self-aware, it's not so implicit. And the famous story, or the famous example given in the 20th century by this woman, Nehemia Leibowitz, she was a Bible commentator in Israel. And she said, every reading of a text is an interpretation. She said, when we read, thou shalt not murder, it says in Hebrew, lo tirtzach. So you could read it, thou shalt not murder. And at least in the Jewish Israeli intonation, that means you're not going to murder. Of course you're going to murder. What? Please go murder, right? So in other words, you could read it as a rhetorical question, right? So imagine if you see someone, I don't know, coming out of the bathroom and you say, you're not going to wash your hands. That means go wash your hands. So you could read in Hebrew, lo tirtzach. You're not going to murder, right? Meaning go murder. Now, nobody in their right mind would read it that way. You'd be an idiot to read it that way. But by not reading it that way, you're actually applying a principle. And the principle is, when I read the text, it's got to make sense. Doesn't make sense God's telling me that not to murder, because in other places, first of all, that would be an unethical God. But also, there's other places where it says if you murder, you're executed. So why would he be telling me to murder? But the point is, when I read Lo Tirtzach, you shall not murder, I don't read it as you shall not murder. And why don't I do that? Because it doesn't make sense to read it that way. So that's an important principle. The Bible needs to make sense. It's the word of God, and we're told, he says in Isaiah, come, let us reason. So reason is a principle that you are allowed and must use when you read the Tanakh. And I think when you read any ancient text. Now, there are ancient texts that aren't reasonable, right? If I'm reading the Zohar, the main book of Kabbalah, there will be things that the author meant in an irrational way. I don't think that's the case in the Tanakh. So the point is, everything's an interpretation. Every reading of a text is an interpretation. I'd rather interpret the text myself rather than rely on somebody else. And so what I would recommend for those who can't read it in Hebrew is look at multiple English translations, and when they differ, ask the question, what's going on here? Why are they differing? Mm-hmm. And try to find an answer.
Mm-hmm. And that's what I always had, all the concordances out in front of me. Todd Corder said something that I think is really important. He said some translations say no servile labor. I take that as to cease from my paying job. It doesn't prevent me from serving in the preservation of life. So might be different for doctors, firefighters, police officers. Theirs is intrinsic to the preservation of life. What are your thoughts on that?
So I'll give you the short answer. So first of all, there's a principle in the Torah that says God gives us these commandments and we will live by them. And if someone's going to die, with maybe a few exceptions, then you've got to go save their life. There's another commandment: you shall not stand by the blood of your fellow. It's in Leviticus 19. It's alongside love your neighbor as you love yourself, and don't hate your fellow in your heart. And what it means is, if you see someone who is dying, you're required to go save them. And we see that the army of Israel went out against the Philistines in 1 Samuel. It says for 40 days every day. So that means on Shabbat they went out to war. They were standing in their battle array with their full armor, right? So they were working in the heat, right? The summer heat. How do I know it was summer? Because in winter it rains and people don't go out to war in ancient Israel because the roads are muddy. Same reason you don't come 50 days after Sukkot to Jerusalem. So in ancient Israel is. So the point is that they didn't stop for Shabbat and say, okay, Philistines, we hope you don't attack us, but we're not going to go fight because it's Shabbat. In fact, you're required to defend people and save lives on Shabbat. And if you're a doctor, now you shouldn't be scheduling, routine visits on Shabbat. But if you're a doctor working in an ER, somebody's got to work in the ER on Shabbat or people will die. That doesn't mean you need to do, like I said, routine stuff, but you should save lives on Shabbat, absolutely.
And Dan,
and for a policeman as well. I think we've seen what can happen is if you defund the police and you have no police on Shabbat, that wouldn't be good.
And Dan Ian said the word work is one of those imperfectly translated words. And he's saying that we need a good study and discussion. Yes, I love that discussion. I agree. Is there anything in the Torah about the day to build or to take down the sukkah, Nehemia?
In a sense, it says to do it on the first day, to build it. It doesn't say about taking it down, but then that might also mean by the first day. Someone had a comment here, which I think is worth addressing. They said, y'all need to stop putting down us rabbinic Jews. And I try not to put down rabbinical. I definitely hope I don't put down rabbinic Jews. I will definitely express, I have different views on certain things in the Bible and look, in a sense, rabbinical Judaism, because it is the dominant form of Judaism out there in the world today, has to be the starting point, for me at least. If I'm talking about it coming and also being raised as a rabbinical Jew, my starting point is, okay, here's what I was raised with, and I want to peel away the layers of the onion, right? And some of those layers go back 2,000 years, right? I'm talking about Targum Onkelos, where he says he's using the second, and Josephus, right, who was also a Pharisee, by the way, a rabbinical Jew. And I'm saying, okay, let's peel away those layers of the onion, and here's how it evolved over time, and can we learn anything from that? And often we can. So for me, that's a frame of reference, but number one, because I came from that, and my ancestors maybe for 2,000 years were part of that. And I hope that doesn't come across as polemical, but rather as this is a Jewish context, and I'm trying to understand the Tanakh within its historical and Jewish context, and to also distinguish between different layers of that context. I love it that this rabbi in 1108 says, I looked through the Tanakh and I couldn't find the meat Shavuot called Atzeret, but our rabbis call it that everywhere, right? He's doing exactly what I'm trying to do. What does it mean now? And what did it originally mean? And what did it mean in different periods? So,
is it also that outside of Israel, we have to feast 8 days, and in Israel 7?
You lost me on that one.
Yeah.
No, the point is that Orthodox Jews, and I don't think Reform Jews do this. I don't actually know about conservative Jews. Orthodox Jews outside of Israel keep 9 days. And in Israel, Orthodox Jews keep 8 days. Reform Jews, I believe, keep 8 days everywhere because they don't accept the idea of the negation of the diaspora. I mean, there's this idea in Orthodox Judaism, and I would say in the Tanakh, that it's not ideal to be outside of the land of Israel. That's called negation of the diaspora. And Reform Jews say, no, I'm a German because it started in Germany. I'm an American, and I'm not a fish out of water. I'm just in a different sea. I'm in a different lake. So I'm not going to do something different than what's done in Israel because I'm not in a lesser status place. I'm just in a different place. And so they do 8 days outside of Israel as well.
Eric, I would love for your words to be, send it to everyone, because you're talking about what conservatives follow. Would you do that to everyone so that people can see your
answers? Conservatives follow 9 days. So I actually didn't know that. So that's interesting.
Yeah. Some of my associates associate the word atzeret with tarrying, extending, or waiting. Did you address that?
Tarrying?
Tarry, Tarry, tarrying, extending, or waiting. Did we see that in our study?
No. Well, so so that actually we did in a sense. There was a rabbi who brought the parable of you keep the son an extra day.
Okay.
Right. The son who lives far away, you tell him, stay an extra day with me. That's, I guess, where it comes from. But it also comes from atzal, which is to stop. And in that sense, you could say it's to stop, stop leaving and stay here an extra day, meaning that maybe that's where they get it from. But it just means assembly in the top. Why does it mean assembly is an interesting question. How do you get from the word stop to assembly isn't obvious, and it's a complicated question. And here's where it really gets complicated. And maybe this is too complicated for this kind of setting with over 250 people. But in Hebrew, we have 22 letters. But actually, in ancient Hebrew, there were more than 22 linguistic letters. And what I mean is there were 22 graphic symbols, but obviously there's more than 22 letters because we have sheen and seen, which are 2 different letters. So that's already 23. And it turns out that there's more than one ayin in ancient Hebrew, and there's more than one sadi in ancient Hebrew. So and we see that when we compare Hebrew to other Semitic languages, and I won't go into more than that because that's very complicated. But what that means is although the word stop and the word assemble have the same 3-letter root, they might actually be different roots in ancient Hebrew. And we don't have enough information to prove it one way or another, but we have to assume that could be the case here. And maybe that's why assemble and stop have nothing to do with each other.
The difference between the last great day and shining Atzeret.
It's autocorrect. Shemini Atzeret.
Shemini Atzeret.
I presume that's autocorrect. I don't know. So last great day is not a term that I'm familiar with from historical sources. I know there's some people who refer to it as the last great day, where I think it has eschatological connotations. Okay. Yeah. I mean, Shemini Atzeret probably is a little bit hard for some people to say. It's got that tsa. I never have a problem with the tsa. I understand how people have, but I understand is, I have a friend who instead of tzitzit says the zit seats. So, right. So it's, I guess in some English pronunciations, that's difficult to pronounce. Someone asked a really good question. Will this feast always land on a Sabbath for the eighth day? So, no, it's on average, I don't know that this is actually true, but presumably on average it'll be once every 7 years. Meaning I can't imagine why it wouldn't on average be once every seven
Yeah.
years, but statistics are kind of a funny thing. Um, but
Riva,
yeah, so it could be any day of the week.
Riva asked, is the water libation a historical part
Uh,
of the eighth day of celebration?
it's
I
an
don't,
historical part, it's just not a biblical part.
well, there you go. Uh,
Meaning of Sukkot in general. Um, Someone asked a really interesting question that's for you, Linnell, and it's so much fun. So let's go to it. It
uh-oh.
says, if you grew up in the King James, do you see the Mandela effect changes? Dun, dun, dun. I know that in the original Bible, that was stolen from us by the devil.
Why don't you
There were penguins
explain the Mandela effect in just a
and
few
hedgehogs.
words so
So the
people
Mandela
understand that?
effect is this idea that there are certain things well, first of all, it's a real thing in the sense that there are things that we all remember that are not the case. So everybody remembers from my generation that uh, Darth Vader said to Luke, "Luke, I am your father." And you go back to look at the movie, the Star was it Star Wars or Empire
Mm.
Strikes Back? I don't remember which movie. Uh, Whichever movie it was. And he doesn't say that. He says Luke, and then he says a whole long spiel, and then he says, I am your father. Right. So he never says the words in that sequence, Luke, I am your father. So why do we remember it wrong? Uh, so that's what the Mandela effect theory is, right? That first thing that we remember things that are not the case, that's a fact. You can't really dispute. And it's in
So
all kinds of ways that happens. So what is the reason for it? Well, there's one theory. Do you want to explain it, babe?
I'm going to let you explain the theory. I'm going to tell you what
Okay.
I think about growing up on the King James version
Mm.
versus the way that we study now. The biggest thing that I have found is that a lot of the verses that I memorized from the New Testament are actually verses that are in the Old Testament. And they may be translated a little differently in the New Testament than they were in the Old Testament. And sometimes they mean completely different things. So to me, that's been the biggest light bulb um, about really studying, because I didn't study the Old Testament, guys. I didn't. I knew the New Testament front to back, but I didn't study Old Testament. And then when I began to look at it, I was like, oh, that's from the New Testament. No, 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 it's the other way around. That's from the Old Testament. Well, what did it mean in the Old Testament? What did it actually mean? And does it mean the same thing today? And so, yes, short, there is definitely the Mandela effect. And
Well, I'm not sure that's what it is,
well,
but
in
anyway,
some
so one
ways.
theory says that CERN in Switzerland opened up a it's hard to say this without laughing. I'm sorry. If there's someone in this group here who believes that, I don't mean any disrespect, but I don't ascribe to this personal theory. I don't personally ascribe to this, but so the theory
What's
is that CERN with their Large Hadron Collider opened up a portal to another universe because they're in league with some demonic force. And if you don't believe it, look, they have at the front, they have a statue of Shiva, which is demonic, the front of CERN in Switzerland. And I hope I'm getting this right. And so some of us have shifted from one universe to another. And in our universe, Luke Skywalker or Darth Vader really did say, Luke, I am your father. And we remember that, even though in this universe he didn't. So that's one possibility, or we just don't remember it right. Which is more likely? You decide.
the New Testament quotations from the Old Testament are often better matched to the Book of Acts as opposed to the Masoretic text. I don't. maybe.
So
I
people
don't
have
know.
written whole dissertations on that. In other words, sometimes the New Testament quotation matches the Septuagint against the Masoretic text. Sometimes it matches the Masoretic text against the Septuagint, and sometimes it matches neither. So there's a hypothesis that when the New Testament was written, they had a third version that they were quoting from that we don't have anymore. Is that possible? Sure. Or maybe they were paraphrasing. Right. There's all kinds of explanations.
The Smith family asked something. We answered this actually at the last.
Somebody said, Nelson, I am your father. Oh, maybe it's somebody named Nelson. Maybe it's not our Nelson.
That's
All right.
hilarious.
Because it looks like their name is Nelson.
Since it's the traditional end of the yearly Torah cycle, the Torah begins
Uh-huh.
with Bereshit, and it ends with Kol Yisrael. Is this significant?
That's an interesting observation. It actually ends with Le'enei Kol Yisrael, before the eyes of all of Israel, which is it's significant in the sense that the Torah begins in the beginning where there aren't even humans, and then God chooses, well, first he actually gives all mankind a test and they fail. So then he chooses Noah and his descendants, and then within the Noah and his descendants, he chooses Abraham, and then among the descendants of Abraham, he chooses Isaac, and then among the descendants of Isaac, he chooses Jacob, and he does that to give this message for all mankind, right? In other words, so he first started out with all mankind, and it didn't work out that way. So he said, okay, I'm going to choose this one particular family to then be my representatives and be an example. And they could be a bad example, but the world's going to see that God interacts with the universe, and he's not just a passive God who sits back and does nothing. And if he can't get all mankind to obey him, he'll show the universe, here's people who obey me, or here's people who disobey me if they so choose, and here's how I interact with the universe. So in that sense, absolutely, it has a significance. Meaning it's part of the theme, or you could call it the Torah plan of salvation in a sense, right? To borrow a term from somewhere else.
Does mental health work in a jail setting against the Shabbat or holy days?
I guess it depends if I don't know enough about mental health work. In other words, are you doing something that's emergency work, or are you doing something that can wait until Sunday?
Mhm.
Right. And there's definitely, if somebody is having a, schizophrenic break or whatever, and they're, stabbing themselves in the eye and they need some kind of treatment, we'll definitely give them treatment. If they're, they need to have a chat because they don't like being in jail, then probably that can wait until Sunday. I don't know.
Since
I'm
it
not
is
a doctor.
This was interesting. If for some reason we missed Sukkot, would it be okay to do what the Maccabees did?
Which is that they celebrated in
no,
Kislev on the 25th, which was also well, they did it as soon as they could, which was on the anniversary of when the temple had been taken over by the pagans. The Torah doesn't have that institution. In other words, in the
Yeah.
Torah, you would just do it next year, I think. For Passover, for the sacrifice, it has it, not for the Feast of Unleavened Bread. But no, it doesn't have that. There's no Sukkot Sheni, a second Sukkot in the Torah or in the Tanakh.
I've always wanted to know why people say the Jewish people in biblical terms when it's not just the Jewish people, but the 12 tribes of the house of Israel. Why do people say the Jewish people?
So it's interesting. We don't. Meaning in traditional Jewish sources, you don't usually find the term Ha'am HaYehudi, the Jewish people. That's not a thing. That's something that comes about in the 19th century, really, when they're translating from other from European languages. In traditional Jewish sources, you actually have three categories of people, like in the synagogue, who come to read from the Torah. You have Levi. The first one who reads is Kohen, who's descended from Aaron, and second one is Levi, who's a Levite, and the third one isn't Jew. The third one is Israel. Right. So and if you look in traditional Jewish sources, they'll talk about Am Yisrael, literally the people of Israel, and that will be translated into English as the Jewish people, which is, you're right, inaccurate. I agree with you. But what this person's probably talking about is the 10 lost tribe theory, which I think is beyond the scope of today's discussion.
Why does the Torah cycle reading begin? Let's take this as our last question, I guess. Why does the
What was
Torah
the question? I didn't
why
hear
does
it.
the Torah reading cycle begin and end after Sukkot rather than right after Passover?
As the man sang, tradition, tradition.
Yeah.
But the real answer is that
Okay.
in the Torah, in Deuteronomy, it talks about gathering every 7 years on Sukkot and reading the
Mm.
entire Torah during that 7 day period. And so they say, well, we're not going to read the whole Torah on a 7 day period, but we'll read it throughout the course of the year and we'll end it on Sukkot, right? That's really where the tradition comes
So
from.
Brett had
Presumably, maybe there's some other source of it.
during your teaching, Brett had a question, and he's
Oh.
very, very, this is really important to him. And he wants to know how he can find out about whether he is part of the lost tribes or whether he's actually
Is that what he's asking? The lost tribe?
ancestrally. Brett, what are you asking? Ask the question. He asked a whole bunch of questions. What is the question you want to know about becoming? He doesn't want to know about becoming a part of or joining yourself to Israel, which is a really great teaching. And I think that might be helpful to you to know that teaching. I'm asking if I'm
So
partial.
that's a teaching that's currently on Nehemia's wall. It's about, I think it's called something like conversion in
Yeah,
the Tanakh
somebody
or
already
something
gave him
like
that,
that.
actually. The
Oh,
question,
great.
yeah,
All right.
I'm asking if
That's my answer.
I'm descended from one of the tribes. Like he's looking
Yeah.
at DNA. He doesn't have
Oh.
paperwork, but he wants to know.
Oh.
Guys, do you have any idea about how to find your
Yeah, the real
ancestry?
answer is we don't currently have a way of doing that. And anybody who tells you that we do either knows more than I do or they are wrong. Probably the latter. But so basically at this point, DNA is really interesting how it works. People say, I'm 3% Native American. And what do they really mean by that? That means there are people who self-reported that they're Native American, and then your DNA is now being compared to that person or that group of people. Is that correct? I don't know. Maybe they were wrong and they're not really Native American, or maybe they're partially something else. So somebody asked, is Ashkenazi any tribe in particular? So the answer to that is no. They have done DNA tests and found that most Jews all over the world have some DNA in common. Ashkenazim do have a very specific set of DNA markers, and that's because there's something called the bottleneck. The bottleneck is believed to have happened in the 4th century, where most Jews in Europe died from the Black Plague or from massacres that happened all over Northern Europe. And there's about 10 million Jews today who are descended from those survivors. And it's not clear how many survivors there were. It might have been 10,000. It might have been 350, depending who you believe. And that bottleneck means that everybody's kind of like cousins. Not to mention, my great-grandparents were first cousins, and that was extremely common. And still is common for many Jews today, both Ashkenazim and Sephardim, to marry first cousins. But if you compare Ashkenazic DNA to Sephardic DNA, for example, they have a lot in common. In fact, one of the common names for Sephardic Jews is Ashkenazi, because there were Jews from Europe who moved to the Sephardic countries.
You have been listening to Hebrew Voices with Nehemia Gordon. Thank you for supporting Nehemia's Makor Hebrew Foundation. Learn more at nehemiaswall.com.